after the exile. We have this odd verse at the beginning of the first chapter where it says, in the 30th year. And there's a lot of dispute about that. I've taken the approach that that's Ezekiel's 30th year, that is disputable, but in any case, he certainly lived for decades in the land of Israel before he was taken to exile. So we talked a little bit about what that would have looked like. Now, one of the things that makes that interesting is he is the son of a priest, and he almost certainly would have heard Jeremiah preaching in the temple courts, or at least heard about him as a young man. And as we'll see, he has a number of sections in his book that look influenced by Jeremiah. However, at a certain point, when Nebuchadnezzar finally came a-knocking on the doors of Judah, Israel had ceased to exist for some time. Back in 722 BC, Israel had been wiped out, the northern nation under the Assyrian army. So now Assyria has been taken over by Babylonia, and so we can get rid of that. And they come a-knocking. Typical threefold process is to put a city or a country under vassalage, which means they pay you money and soldiers every year to avoid being taken control of. Second base is if they can't pay up or if they resist, you also put a puppet king on their throne so that they're ostensibly run by a foreign power. And then in the third place, you take over. Ezekiel was taken with a large number of other competent people when Nebuchadnezzar took the city. That was typical too. You don't want the most intelligent and capable people in town because they're the ones who are going to start a revolt. You're going to take them out and leave the poor and the uneducated, and you will employ, kind of like we read about in the book of Daniel, the best educated and the most capable people in your own service. So Ezekiel goes to live in Babylon, not far from the city of Nippur, which is a very well-educated city. Most of our best cuneiform documents come from that place, either that or Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal's library is. And at a certain point, a few years after exile, we read in the beginning of the first chapter, he receives a vision. So even though he's been trained as a priest, he is going to become a prophet. In this vision that begins in the first chapter of Ezekiel and extends well through chapter 2 and 3, is probably one of the most detailed vision, it is the most detailed vision in the whole Old Testament. As we've seen in previous weeks, it has a huge impact on the book of Revelation and on the book of Daniel. His calling is to, it's interesting, he's in his house, he receives regular visits from the elders of Israel, but he's not supposed to say anything. He's supposed to enact things. And so he lays on his left side, and he lays on his right side, and he sets up a little brick with a map of the city of Jerusalem, he shaves his head and his beard. A third part of it, his hair, he burns in the midst of the city. A third part of his hair, he strikes around the city. And a third part of his hair, he scatters to the wind and chases it with a sword. Now, he can't do this if he's bound the whole time. So we talked a little bit last week. While he's looking at the city, he's sort of tied with the ropes. He can't be doing that all day, certainly not for months at a time. So for a certain part of the day, he does that, and then he goes out. All of this is part of what scholars sometimes call enacted prophecy, where people, prophets particularly, not just in Israel, in other countries too, play out their oracles rather than say them. However, in chapter 5, where we're beginning today, and then in verse 5, he has a number of spoken words. And we've learned earlier that he is to prophesy against the city of Jerusalem while he's lying on his side. And many scholars believe, and I would, this is probably the substance of what he said. It might not be a verbatim report, but while he's on his side, he's prophesying against the city. And so he goes through the symbolic actions, and then he has this sort of verbalization that he does. So that's where we're going to pick up today, in chapter 5, beginning in the 5th verse. And so I'll use that text. There might be a few changes in the lesson that I've handed out, because I've done some translational work. But before I jump into that, that's just to sort of set the stage. Any questions at this point? Ezekiel is, he's an odd guy. So, if he does all of these actions, the question is, well, what do they all mean? Chapter 4, verse 7 says, "You shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem with your arm bared and prophesy against the city." And so that suggests this idea that in chapter 5, verse 5, we have an account of the substance of what he was saying. Chapter 5, verse 5 also begins with this phrase, "Thus says," my translation says, "Lord God." The Hebrew text is Adonai Yahweh, and Ezekiel has been told that whenever he's given these instructions specifically, this is to be public knowledge for everyone, which is tricky. There's going to be about 7 years until the fall of Jerusalem, and during that time, he's allowed to say some things, and there's other things he's not allowed to say. And so beginning in chapter 5, verse 5, this is what we have. "This is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations, with the countries all around her. She has rebelled against my rules by doing wickedness more than the nations, and against my statutes more than the countries all around her. For they have rejected my rules and have not walked in my statutes. Therefore thus says Adonai Yahweh, because you are more turbulent than the nations that are all around you, and have not walked in my statutes or obeyed my rules, have not even acted according to the rules of the nations that are around you. You're even worse than the pagan nations. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yahweh, behold, I, even I, am against you. I will execute judgments in your midst in the sight of the nations, that is, the non-Jewish nations. Because of all your abominations, that's an important word. We'll have to talk about that word. That's a technical term, abominations. I will do with you what I have never yet done, and the like of which I will never do again. The fathers shall eat their sons in your midst. Sons shall eat their fathers. And I will execute judgments on you, and any of you who survive I will scatter to all of the winds. Therefore, as I live, declares Adonai Yahweh, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things, with all your abominations, therefore I will withdraw. My eye will not spare. I will have no pity. A third part of you shall die of pestilence and be consumed with famine in your midst. A third part shall fall by the sword all around you, and a third part I will scatter to the winds, and will unsheath the sword after them. And then in verse 13, thus shall my anger spend itself. I will vent my fury upon them and satisfy myself. And this is a very important phrase for Ezekiel. They shall know that I am Yahweh, and I have spoken in my jealousy when I spend my fury upon them. Moreover, I will make you a desolation and an object of reproach among the nations all around you and in the sight of all who pass by. You shall be a reproach and a taunt and a warning and a horror to the nations all around you when I execute judgments on you in anger and fury and with furious rebukes. I am Yahweh, I have spoken. When I send against you the deadly arrows of famine, arrows for destruction, which I will send to destroy you, and when I bring more and more famine upon you and break your supply of bread, I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will rob you of your children. Pestilence and blood shall pass through you. I will bring the sword upon you. I am Yahweh, I have spoken. So that is 17 verses of some really encouraging scripture. I'm going to put those in the liturgy and repeat them from time to time. These are not the most popular verses of Scripture. A few things. This is sort of a side issue. This opening verse, this is Jerusalem. I've set her at the center of the nations with countries all around. I put a footnote here which I've called bad cosmology. Some of you have probably seen old maps of the universe with Jerusalem at the center of the universe. Those became widespread in the Middle Ages. So biblical literalism has always been a problem. I think it's evident from this passage that Ezekiel is not trying to tell us about cosmology. He's not saying that the city of Jerusalem lies at the center of planet Earth or the cosmos or anything like that. But certainly prior to the scientific revolution, people read that into what Ezekiel was saying. So I put a little footnote about that. That's just sort of a warning of over-pressing biblical literalism to the point of absurdity. Ezekiel's point is that Jerusalem is the queen among the nations, but he's not trying to talk about space and time and physics or anything like that. He mentions that Israel is more turbulent than the nations around her and has even fallen short of the moral standards of the pagan nations. And that's a big issue for Ezekiel and Jeremiah and the other prophets. He also says this word abominations. The Hebrew there is toeba, and that means idolatry. We find that a lot in the book of Deuteronomy. And the point is that other nations have been faithful to their gods, their own moral principles, and Israel has not. And there's an irony there because Israel's God and Israel's moral principles are higher. And yet she has abandoned them. In many ways has fallen short of even the standards of the people around her. Footnote 41, where he says, I will do what I have never yet done and the like of which I will never do again. Fathers shall eat their sons, sons shall eat their fathers. We read in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, and Jeremiah the extremity of warfare, that parents will be compelled to actually commit cannibalism against their own offspring. There's a few stories in the Old Testament about that. Have any of you read some of those stories? Some of them occur in connection with the Elijah stories, where Israel is at war against Aram or Elisha the prophet, and people are actually so hungry that they're eating their own offspring.
Also the book of
Lamentations mentions it. It's a dreadful thing, but it's said that that will be the extremity of the people's condition. Ezekiel bumps it up a notch in this particular passage, where children actually eat their own parents. So there's an example of, fan it off. Right? Yeah, fan it off. Yeah, there's an example of the extremity of need and difficulty that the people will face. It shows on the one hand that Ezekiel is familiar with the contents that we still have in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We don't know that he had the books as we currently have, but the material that is preserved in those books is clearly familiar to him. And in some ways, he's developing a little bit further upon that. So those are sort of interesting features. Some people say that Leviticus and Deuteronomy are very, very late books. And in their final form, they may very well be. But the contents of those books are clearly familiar to him. And he's discussing them here. And he also draws upon the idea of the passion of Yahweh. Like Jeremiah and Hosea, he portrays Yahweh as a husband. The nation of Israel is his wife, and she is involved in adultery with other suitors, which in the religious sense means that she's involved in idolatry. Yahweh is the one that she should worship, but she worships all of these other things, and he, as a jealous husband, is going to enact retribution. This is not a popular metaphor in our time. I don't know if that occurred to you.
It's a good thing it's not going on now.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what's going on in these passages sort of just reeks of our own culture. But the whole idea of the faithless wife and the angry husband doesn't resonate with us as it did in Ezekiel's time. It just offends people. But it certainly resonated in its own time that Yahweh had been a good husband to Israel. He had cared for her. He had taken care of her, and she had been faithless to him, and that he was well within his rights to be angry. So we have a metaphor here that has been handed down through many, many centuries, but it's not a metaphor that does much for people in our own time except make them upset, because the mores have changed. And so that's one of the difficulties with reading these ancient texts, is they're written from within the time and the place and the social mores of their day. Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's part of it, is that that's certainly part of it. Passages from Ezekiel and Jeremiah are not popular preaching. But I think one of the things we have to do as responsible readers of the Bible is we have to lift ourselves out of our own time with its particular social moral biases and enter into a very, very different time. And that can be difficult. So while Ezekiel is lying on his side and he's got the little model of Jerusalem in front of him, he is saying these things to this model of Jerusalem. The elders are there in his household and they are hearing this. They are understanding what he is saying. This is an exceedingly unpopular message because, as we'll see, most of the prophets are not saying this. They are saying that Yahweh will deliver Jerusalem and everything is still good and this whole thing's going to blow over. And Ezekiel is not saying this at all. He is saying that they have been religiously, morally faithless and they're going to suffer. And Yahweh's pretty much made up his mind. So the next section here has to do with private and public oracles. And I've mentioned in chapters, Ezekiel has certain things that he is to present to the public. Whenever Yahweh says to him, "Thus says Adonai Yahweh," that's a message for everybody. But he has many messages that if we read carefully, it's evident that he's the only one who receives them. He may reveal something about them later on, and so he leads a little bit of a double life. Chapter 6 and 7, so that's what we're looking at here in the latter half. Both begin with the phrase, "The word of Yahweh came to me." But that doesn't necessarily mean he delivers it in public. So that's the trick. Top of page 27. And Ezekiel uses several times this expression for Yahweh. He calls it one speaking himself. It's not generally rendered in the translations. I think it's a fascinating phrase because, everybody here, when we pray, we are sort of involved in a dialogue with ourselves. We're talking to God, but we're also kind of muttering to ourselves. So I think non-religious people do. So in some ways, I think that religion is very good for non-religious people because it's much more sensible when you walk around every day going blah, 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 to actually be talking to someone instead of just muttering to yourself, which is really the picture of a mad person, just sitting around talking to yourself all day. This is not the sign of a healthy person. And we all do it to some extent. In some ways, if you're not religious, I kind of got in the back of my head that you're really condemned to a certain sort of madness because you're going to talk. You're going to mutter to yourself. You're going to talk to yourself. And this interesting idea that Ezekiel has that Yahweh does that too. And he's talking to Ezekiel while he's talking to himself. It's an interesting expression that when man prays, kind of talking to himself and to God at the same time, that's what God does. And Ezekiel's been given he's been given an audience with that. It's just a really, really fascinating Hebrew expression. So we learn kind of from these passages, though, that Ezekiel didn't lie on his side all hours of the day, He has to bake bread. That's part of it. He certainly has to use the bathroom, so he has to get up and move about. He certainly has to prophesy to the city lying in front of him. But he makes excursions in and out of his house from time to time, and he does deliver certain oracles to the people. And that's probably part of why the elders go and visit him in his house from time to time to see what he's going to do next. So in chapter 6, verses 1 to 14, we have the first oracle, which begins in private, but then extends into the public sphere. Where he prophesies to the mountains. And I'll read this. The mountains of Israel. So we got to figure that Ezekiel's in Babylonia, but he is prophesying west to the mountains in Israel. The word of Yahweh came to me, chapter 6, verse 1. Son of man, set your face toward the mountains of Israel and prophesy against them. And say, you mountains of Israel, hear the word of Adonai Yahweh. Thus says Adonai Yahweh to the mountains and the hills, the ravines and the valleys. Behold, I, even I, will bring a sword upon you and will destroy your high places. Now the high places, the Hebrew bamot, does anybody know anything about that expression? It's a Hebrew word, bamot. They usually translate it high places. It refers to hills located throughout Israel. But the Israelites aren't supposed to worship on hills. They're supposed to worship in the temple in Jerusalem. And so usually those are places where worship of other deities may have taken place. So Ezekiel's called to prophesy against the high places. Your altars shall become desolate, your incense altars shall be broken. I will cast down your slain before your idols. I will lay the dead bodies of the people of Israel before their idols. I will scatter your bones around your altars. Wherever you dwell, the cities shall be waste, the high places ruined. Your altars will be waste and ruined, your idols broken and destroyed, your incense altars cut down, your works wiped out. And the slain shall fall in your midst. And here he goes again. You shall know that I am Yahweh. The point here is that a lot of people are going to have doubt about religion and faith and God and all this kind of thing. And unfortunately, Ezekiel's message is that they're only really going to believe when they suffer. Suffering is the only thing that's going to make them believe. And when all of the things that they put their hope in, all of the things that they thought would save them, all of the things that they thought were good and that they believed in, only when all that's wiped out, then Ezekiel says, okay, you'll get it. I could use this in school sometime. When you get an F on your report card, then you will know that I am Mr. Lewis. Then you will see that, yes, indeed, I will bring my judgment swiftly upon you. Because they're not going to believe until something hurts them, where they, where it counts. And so that seems to be the idea here. And that's not really what Yahweh wants, certainly not what Mr. Lewis wants. I want to give everybody an A. I want to give everybody an A. But you've raised kids, you've worked with people. How many have discovered that sometimes that's the only point where people get it? That's the only point where it really captures them. So that's the idea here. Yeah.
The fact that Ezekiel was predicting something that happened, and I wish you would do something. And Ezekiel is, to some degree, in the same sort of situation.
No, that's right. Ezekiel has about 7 years of performing these sort of symbolic actions that we're talking about before anything he says actually happens. And it's important to bear in mind that all the while that is the case, there's room for skepticism. Everybody who sees what he's doing is going to say, you're a nutcase. You don't know what you're talking about. And so, to some extent, that's why some of his prophecies he has to keep to himself. There's going to be room for skepticism. A lot of people don't think that it's going to happen. And with Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, if we read those books closely, we have to remember they were surrounded by dozens of other prophets. None of anything that those other prophets we don't know who they were. We don't know what they said. Nothing of it's been recorded. Why? Well, a big part is because nothing they ever said actually happened. and in some cases, over a century would take place before people would say, this person knew what they were talking about. And then it's preserved and it's handed down, and then these works are studied. And I think with each of the prophets, there's usually a major event, one or several in their life that vindicated them in the eyes of the people. Certainly for Isaiah, those of you who know the story of the prophet Isaiah, the destruction of the Assyrian army was a big one. And the moment he predicted that against all rational odds, his status as a prophet was sealed. And then everything that he ever said was scoured. Ezekiel too, with the fall of Jerusalem, and certainly Jeremiah, and in large part because most people weren't saying that. They were a minority opinion among the people. So those are things to sort of bear in mind. Jesus of Nazareth too, in the New Testament, with his predictions of the destruction of the temple and of his own resurrection, those were big deals. So top of page 28. Ezekiel does say something in chapter 6, verse 3. Verse 8, excuse me. I got a typo here. So it all sounds like doom and gloom. But in chapter 6, verse 8, he says, "Yet I will leave some of you alive." Now, we wouldn't know that unless he said it, because it sounds like everybody's going to get wiped out. "When you have among the nations some who escape the sword, when you are scattered through the countries, then those of you who do escape will remember me among the nations where they are carried captive. How I have been broken over their whoring heart that has departed from me, and over their eyes that go whoring after their idols. And they will be loathsome in their own sight for the evils that they have committed and for all their abominations. And they shall know that I am Yahweh. I have not said in vain that I would do this evil to them." So this is the idea of a remnant. And Ezekiel here is drawing on Jeremiah, he's drawing on Isaiah. A third of this, a third of this, and a third of this. Well, you know how thirds work. There's like a little bit left. And the idea is that some people will survive, and they will remember what has happened, and they will carry the memory of what has happened forward into future generations. And so in verse 11 then he says, thus says Adonai Yahweh. Now when Ezekiel says that, I'm arguing in this class, that's a public oracle. He's to deliver that to the people, and they're to hear that. Clap your hands and stamp your feet and say, alas, because of all the evil abominations of the house of Israel, they shall fall by the sword, by famine and by pestilence. He who is far off shall die of pestilence. He who is near shall fall by the sword, and he who is left is preserved shall die of famine. And I will spend my fury upon them. And you shall know that I am Yahweh when the slain lie among the idols and among the altars, on every high hill, on every mountain top, under every leafy oak, where they offer pleasing aroma to all their idols. I will stretch out my hand against them and make them desolate and waste. All their desolate dwelling places, from the wilderness of Riblah, they will know that I am Yahweh. I get the idea that for these years, prior to the fall of Jerusalem, Ezekiel is entirely of doom. He doesn't have any word of redemption or hope. It's entirely of doom. When he receives words of redemption and hope, he's the only one who hears about them. But after Jerusalem falls, then he will reveal those things, because the point is that the people at this point are so hardened, they don't need words of redemption and hope. Most of the prophets are telling them that they're going to be fine. And it's not appropriate for Ezekiel to say that at this point. Why does Yahweh reveal it to Ezekiel? Well, Ezekiel needs to believe it. Because he's in it for the long game. And he needs to know why he's doing what he's doing. So we have an interesting contrast between the private life of Ezekiel and the public life of Ezekiel. Publicly, all he delivers is doom and gloom to the people. Privately, he knows and believes there's a longer view in mind. He's not been permitted to say that yet. And I kind of understand that. So turning over to chapter 7, verse 1 to 27, that's where we'll end today. There's this phrase in the Old Testament called the day of the Lord. Now, Lord, if you read it in the Old Testament with all caps, which doesn't work with me because I always write in all caps, is the name Yahweh. But if you're reading in your translation, capital L, lowercase O-R-E-D, then that's the Hebrew word Adonai, which pretty much means Lord in English, or if you're a Latin person, Dominus. Or if you're a Greek person, Kyrios. Some of you know the Kyrie Christe, Lord have mercy. Kyrie, Lord, or Dominus in Latin, or Adonai in Hebrew. It refers to the or Lord in English. It refers to the idea of the master. The master. But any time in your Bibles you see the word spelled with all caps, that's the divine name. That's the divine name. It dawned on you at some point in all of your Bible reading that the name Yahweh is never mentioned. It's all throughout your Bible. It's just there's an old tradition of never translating it, which is a token of respect. And so instead of saying Yahweh, just like my kids don't walk into class every morning and say, Chad. Say, no, that's Mr. Lewis to you. It's a token of familiarity. They say, okay, yeah, Mr. Lewis. So in the same way, we have a habit, whenever we see this name Yahweh, we translate it Lord, just out of respect. Just out of respect. Yeah.
That translation tradition begins with William Tyndale, carries over into the King James Version, and every
Well, and the prefaces are very good. You know, nobody reads the preface to their Bible translation. But it's actually, you should. Because that's where the translator's sort of telling you what they're doing. And they sort of lay it all out. We usually just jump right into Kings or Chronicles or whatever it is, or Corinthians, whatever we're reading. But read the prefaces, because there the translators are usually very upfront, and they say, okay, here we've got 6 or 7 different rules that we've done. This is what they are. But the reason I mention that, because we have this idea of the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord. That first appears in Amos, as far back as we can trace it in the 8th century, even before the days of Isaiah. And this is how I often discuss it, and then I'll read the passage here from Ezekiel, because Ezekiel takes it over. It's a popular theme. That Israel's pretty discouraged, you know, that they've got all these promises handed down from the time of Moses, and nothing seems to be working out. And so people struggle with that today. They say, why is there so much evil in the world? Why doesn't God do something? If I'm walking down the street and I see a woman being harmed in an alley, I would do something. Unless I'm a coward, I would get involved and I would do something. I would try to save that person. Why doesn't Yahweh do something? And then you have these phrases that appear throughout Ezekiel and Jeremiah where the people are saying, Yahweh does not see. He does not listen. He does not care. Which is pretty close to saying he does not exist. There is no Yahweh, which is why these things are going on. And Amos is the first, and Isaiah follows, and Jeremiah follows, and Ezekiel follows, the saying that Yahweh has a day. He will intervene, but he's God, so he's not a citizen among the rest of us who's walking down an alley and has to save a woman. He has to kind of do things on a global scale. And so he has a day when he will intervene, and he will deal with evil. And that day is coming. And that becomes a very, very popular idea. But by the time Amos gets a hold of it, it's already been popular for a while, and Amos has already a little spin that he puts on it, where he says, you know, everybody talks about the day of Yahweh. He's going to come down and fix good and evil. And Amos says something like, you guys better be careful what you ask for. Because I got a good example of this. I've gotten in arguments with people where they say, why doesn't God eradicate? And then I always say the same thing. I say, think would become of you? Because they always assume blindly that they're the good guy. And that if God got rid of evil, that they would be just fine and intact. And of course, is that so obvious? You know, that if God just wiped out evil, that all the rest of us good guys would be fine? Probably not. And so Amos says the same thing. He says, you know, woe to you who ask for the day of the Lord. That day will be darkness. When Yahweh comes and reckons through good and evil, all of us are going to have a whole lot of trouble. And that was Amos' twist on it.
Amos gives an example. It's like a man running from a bear. He finally gets into his house and leans up against the wall panting, and a snake bites him. That's what the day of Yahweh is going to be like.
That was not a popular sermon. That was not a popular sermon. Yes, that's what he says. So the prophets of ancient Israel have this idea that there is a day when Yahweh will enter into time and space and history and deal with evil. But they also have this added idea that it's going to be a tough day not just for the evil, bad people out there, but for God's own people. And Ezekiel picks this theme up. So I mentioned here on the top of page 29, chapter 7, verse 1 through 27, what we could call Ezekiel's spin on the day of the Lord. So I've mentioned all the preparatory stuff. I'll just begin reading out of the ESV, 7, verse 1. This is what Ezekiel has to say about this particular idea. God entering into history and settling the accounts. Now he says, the word of Yahweh came to me. You, son of man, say, thus says Adonai Yahweh to the land of Israel. An end. The end has come upon the four corners of the land. Ezekiel could get himself a sign. The end is here. He could walk around in Detroit. Now the end is upon you. I will send my anger upon you. I will judge you according to your ways. I will punish you for all your abominations. Verse 4, my eye will not spare you. I regard verse 4 and other verses like it throughout Ezekiel as a direct counterthrust to the idea that Yahweh doesn't see. Everybody says God doesn't see anything. And Ezekiel says over and over and over again, my eye will not spare you. He sees everything. And so he's challenging that idea that there is no God. Everything that we do is in secret. Nobody sees anything. And Ezekiel's saying, yes, he does. And my eye will not spare you. I will have no pity. I will punish you for your ways, for your abominations which are in your midst. And then, here he goes again. You will know that I am Yahweh. You're going to find out that I exist. Thus says Adonai Yahweh, disaster after disaster. Behold, it comes. An end is come. The end is come. It has awakened against you. Behold, it comes. Your doom has come to you. O inhabitant of the land, the time has come. The day is near, the day of tumult. Not of joyful shouting on the mountains. Now I will soon pour out my wrath upon you, spend my anger against you, and judge you according to your ways. And I will punish you for all your abominations. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will punish you according to your ways, while your abominations are in your midst. And then you will know that I am Yahweh who strikes. So the day of the Lord isn't just going to be against the bad guys. Everybody's going to get a piece of Yahweh's judgment. Behold, the day comes. Your doom has come. The rod has blossomed. That should remind us of Aaron's rod. Your rod has blossomed. Pride has budded. Violence has grown up into a rod of wickedness. None of them shall remain, nor their abundance, nor their wealth, neither shall there be preeminence among them. All of your money and prestige and success, all the things that people think make them secure. You got to have money and power and prestige. That's how I'm going to be secure. All that's going to come to nothing. The day has arrived. Let not the buyer rejoice, nor the seller mourn, for wrath is on all their multitude. The seller shall not return what he has sold while they live. The vision concerns all their multitude, shall not turn back. And because of his iniquity, none can maintain his life. We rejoice a lot over little victories. Yeah, I sold my house for 3 times what it was worth. And Ezekiel's saying, good for you. Next week it's all going to be different. And actually what he's saying may be historically more accurate, as we'll see later on, because in Israel, because of the desperateness of the situation, a lot of wealthy people appropriated the land and the property of lesser well-off people. Or people had gone into exile. I mean, you can sort of think that if a catastrophe happened here in America and a lot of people lost their homes and their property, other people would take it over. And then they would say, cool, I became a millionaire in 3 weeks. And Ezekiel's saying, there's trouble coming. So a lot of times in desperate situations, people's fortunes improve radically in a short space of time. But Ezekiel's point is that you shouldn't put your trust in that. That's not going to work for you. So he's saying something here in the text, but there's a historical situation that it comes out of. And he's warning people to be too excited about their material prosperity because it's fleeting. It could disappear overnight. Verse 14, they have blown the trumpet and made everything ready, but none goes to battle, for my wrath is upon all their multitude. The sword is without, pestilence and famine are within. He who is in the field dies by the sword, him who is in the city famine and pestilence devour. Any survivor escapes. They will be on the mountains like doves in the valley, all of them moaning, each one over his iniquity. All hands are feeble, all knees turn to water. They put on sackcloth. Horror covers them. Shame is on their faces. Baldness on their heads. They cast their silver into the streets. Their gold is like an unclean thing. Their silver and gold are not able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of Yahweh. They cannot satisfy their hunger or fill their stomachs with it, for it was the stumbling block of their iniquity. So currency has lost its value. And we've seen that even in our own civilization, times where money doesn't have any value anymore.
You can't eat money.
You can't. And so I don't know if this is like an early commentary on inflation. But were there times in American history where people just burned their money? Like literally burned it? Because I don't know. But you do have times where all of the securities that people gather around themselves cease to matter. Sort of like Black Friday and the Great Depression, Everything just goes kaput. So he's talking about the economic collapse of Jerusalem. Verse 20, his beautiful ornament they used for pride. They made their abominable images and their detestable things of it. I make it an unclean thing to them, and I will give it into the hands of foreigners for prey, the wicked of the earth for spoil. They shall profane it. I will turn my face from them. They shall profane my treasured place. Robbers shall enter and profane it. And I'll finish from verse 23 to the end of the chapter. Forge a chain. The land is full of bloody crimes. The city is full of violence. So as the economic and political situation of Jerusalem declines, people begin to kill one another in order to make their lives secure. I will bring the worst of the nations to take possession of their houses. So Jerusalem will be defeated by people who she despises and who she thinks are not worthy. I will put an end to the pride of the strong. Their holy places shall be profaned. When anguish comes, they shall seek peace, but there shall be none. Disaster comes upon disaster. Rumor follows rumor. They seek a vision from the prophet, but the law perishes from the priest and counsel from the elders. The king mourns, prince is wrapped in despair. Hands of the people of the land are paralyzed by terror. According to their way I will do to them, and according to their judgments I will judge them. And again, he concludes with this idea, they shall know that I am the Lord. So the idea is here, and then we'll see if there's any comment. He talks about economic and military difficulties that the city of Jerusalem will face. But religious life will crumble too. People will lose faith. They will stop believing that there's a future for them in all of the things that they put their hope in. In this case, their idols. They'll stop putting their hope in those things. They'll even come to abhor them because they'll realize that there's no hope down that road, and they'll come to despise those kinds of things. Ordinary people will be taken away in chains. Their prophets, their priests, and their kings, their leaders can't do anything for them. And so the people that they look up to and that they think, well, those people will save us, those people will help us, those people know what's going on. No, they're all gone. And so next week we'll get into why all of this is going to happen. But, a lot of people say Jeremiah is the gloomy prophet, but I think Ezekiel's, shooting for the gold here. Maybe, Jeremiah hadn't. Now, he has good news. Ezekiel does have good news, but he doesn't present it up front. He wants to let the people sweat it out a bit, I think is the main issue. So let me see if there's any comments about that. Yeah.
The fact that Jerusalem is under siege for the better part of 2 years means that they've exhausted all of their stored resources. Most of the ancient cities that were walled, they created grain pits to prepare for sieges if they should happen. They lined it with kind of plaster. So once the grain is gone, I don't care how much money you have, you can't eat money. There's nothing to buy because there's nothing left.
Well, and they're under siege. They're not importing or anything.
The whole point of siege is to cut off all
Yeah.
access to the city and basically starve them out, which is exactly what the Babylonians did.
Yeah, we have a lot of give and exchange on an international level. It's easy to forget that at a certain point you reach ground level and you don't really have anything, and gold doesn't mean anything. Like I ask kids at school, well, where does milk come from? And usually they say, well, we get ours from the supermarket down the street. Well, that is true. However, that's not technically where it comes from. And at a certain point, you reach that level. So it's a desperate situation. Desperate situation. And in some ways, the title of the lesson is The Watchman. So the point is that Ezekiel, so we might ask, why is he doing all this? Why is he troubling the people with all this despairing talk? Just as a watchman is set on a high tower and is supposed to say, okay, the enemy's coming. We've only got so much time before they get here. I'm delivering this to you, not to depress you, but so that you have a chance to make a defense for yourself. Ezekiel's message is that these troubles are coming. And the only solution for the people is their faith in the Lord. That's it. And so in some ways he's like an early John the Baptist, or John the Baptist is like a late Ezekiel. He's saying, turn back. Come back to God. Quit worshiping your idols. Quit worshiping all of these different things that give you hope and faith and make you feel very, very cheerful. because there's trouble coming. And when the storm clears, none of the things that you've put your trust and your hope in are going to be left. The only thing you're going to have is your faith in the Lord. And so in some ways, we might ask, why would Ezekiel deliver a message this gloomy and this difficult? But I think basically the point is that the earthly things people put their trust in, they're going to be gone. And if they do survive, their faith in the Lord is all they're going to have. And He's calling them to pursue that. And He got the message pretty early on that 1 out of 100 would actually do it. Most people aren't going to do it because they don't have the chutzpah for it, or the courage, or whatever it is. And so just a note, because we read a lot of gloomy scripture today. So I almost feel kind of guilty. I just feel like, welcome to church. Disaster. Disaster. It's like, and at a certain point, you're like, why is he preaching this? What good can come of it? But I do think that the message is return to God. Because this earth in all of its gloriousness is not a solid foundation upon which to build. It's not the rock. It's the sinking sand of the variegation of life. And I think that's what Ezekiel, as the watchman, is being told to tell the people. So I had to hit a takeaway, because I was reading these verses and I'm like, this is pretty depressing stuff. I don't like reading it.
You don't read it?
What's that?
You don't read it?
I read it. I translate it. I don't like it. I don't like it. I read this stuff. I think, man, if I was one of Ezekiel's contemporaries, I would probably be with the rest. I'd say, get rid of this guy. He's a pain. But in truth, this text is well over 2,000 years old. Everything that everybody in his own time said, nobody knows who they were, what they said, or what they did. They're gone. He's the only one who spoke the truth. And I think that's why it's still with us. And so we just have to bite the bullet and say, yeah, he was right. He was right. So I'll let you go with that thought. But there's good news next week, I promise you.